The fluorescent lights hummed their endless hum as Ashley Cooper pushed through the double doors of Seattle General's trauma unit at 6:41 p.m., her scrubs pristine white, her badge clipped at exactly the right angle, her short dark hair still damp from the shower she'd taken before work. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. She was just another night shift nurse arriving early, moving through the hallways like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, the kind of person you forget the moment she turns a corner. Her locker clicked open to reveal the same careful order she maintained every single day, shoes aligned, extra scrubs folded, a photograph of her mother tucked behind a magnetic mirror. She changed her jacket, the fabric whispering as it slipped over her shoulders, and her fingers found the familiar ridge of the patch sewn into the lining against her ribs. The 101st Airborne insignia, faded to almost nothing, stitched so carefully that no one would ever see it unless they knew to look. She touched it once, the way other people touch crosses or photographs, a private conversation with a version of herself that nobody at Seattle General was meant to meet. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of a hospital at shift change, that moment when the day nurses are leaving, exhausted, and the night nurses are arriving, still wearing the energy of whatever happened before they clocked in. Ashley moved through it with the kind of invisible efficiency that nobody praised and nobody noticed. Her left leg favored slightly as she walked, a compensation so old and practiced that it didn't register as a limp anymore, just the way Major Ashley Cooper had learned to move through the world after 2009. She started her rounds early, as always. It was a habit from another life, the kind of habit you didn't break even when you tried to be someone else. Check the equipment. Know the exits. Understand the layout before the crisis arrives. The ICU held 7 patients tonight, 3 post-operative, 2 cardiac, 1 septic, 1 waiting for a bed in neurology that probably wouldn't come until morning. The monitors beat their steady rhythms, the soundtrack of managed suffering. She knew every patient, had read their charts 3 times, understood their trajectories better than some of the attendings ever would. But when she turned the corner toward bed for B, something shifted. The chart said Army Sergeant Marcus Reeves, 28 years old, admitted 8 hours ago from a mobile VA clinic with acute anxiety, insomnia, and what the intake form delicately called adjustment disorder. There was the standard military service notation, 3 tours, Helm and Province, 2012 to 2015. There were the medications prescribed and not taken, the therapy sessions missed, the slow spiral of a man whose body had made it home but whose mind was still sleeping in a forward operating base. She pulled the curtain aside, careful, quiet, the way you enter a room where something fragile is breaking. He was small. That was the first thing she registered, and it shouldn't have been, because he was 28 and probably weighed 200 pounds, but he looked small in the hospital bed the way all traumatized people look small, folded into themselves, taking up as little space as possible. His dark hair was matted with sweat. His hands were shaking, even in sleep, even medicated. And his face? His face was the face she hadn't seen in 20 years. It was Marcus Reeves when he was 8 years old and terrified, hiding behind her in a concrete-walled clinic while the world exploded outside. It was the same high cheekbones, the same shape of jaw, the same eyes that had looked at her with absolute trust when she pressed him against her body and whispered that she wouldn't let anything happen to him. That was a lie she'd told him then. That was a lie she'd carried since. Ashley's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. Her face remained the perfectly pleasant expression of a night shift nurse preparing to assess a new patient. But her fingers found the patch through her jacket again, pressed hard against it like she could transfer the weight of 20 years through fabric and skin and memory. The chart was incomplete. It always was, the civilian medical record disconnected from whatever had happened overseas, the VA records fragmented and slow, the story that needed telling buried under bureaucratic silence. But she knew the province. She knew the year. She knew exactly which clinic had been near the market where the indirect fire had landed, killing 2 interpreters and wounding 3 soldiers, sending dust and smoke through rooms that should have been safe. She'd been there. She'd been 23 years old and a year into her service, assigned to a forward surgical team in Helmand, and she'd been in that clinic when the mortars came. Before Ashley could complete the vitals check, the doors at the far end of the unit pushed open with the particular kind of force that made even experienced nurses look up. Dr. Richard Ashford arrived on rounds like a general inspecting territory he owned outright. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His watch cost more than Ashley's apartment. His voice had the particular cadence of a man who'd never once been told no and had developed a personality around the expectation of immediate compliance. He moved past the first 3 beds without stopping, his attending physician's gaze sliding across them like they were inventory to be catalogued later. The residents and medical students who trailed behind him, 4 of them today, looking properly intimidated, scrambled to keep pace with their tablets and their carefully prepared presentations. Ashley continued her assessment of Marcus Reeves. Pupils equal and reactive. Breath sounds clear. Heart rate elevated at 98, blood pressure slightly high at 134/82, but neither unexpected for a man who'd been sleeping poorly and living with the particular anxiety that follows deployment. She was gentle with him, efficient, the kind of touch that doesn't startle. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles from things she didn't talk about, moved with absolute precision. When Dr. Ashford reached bed 4B, he barely glanced at the patient. His attention was entirely on Ashley, and it was the wrong kind of attention, the kind that assessed not her competence but her defiance. "Sergeant Reeves," Ashford announced to the gathered residents, not to Marcus. "Routine anxiety admission. Military service, probably PTSD or some variant thereof. These cases are straightforward, stabilize on antidepressants, discharge within 48 hours once the VA accepts transfer, move on. Too many of these beds getting used as shelters when we have actual medical emergencies to manage." He didn't say it quietly. He said it the way men who've never had to earn respect say things, loud enough for everyone to hear, including Marcus, who went very still in his bed. Ashley continued writing notes on the chart. Her pen didn't pause. Her jaw didn't clench. But something in the quality of her stillness changed, the kind of micro-adjustment that someone trained to read people would have noticed. "Dr. Ashford." Her voice was quiet, the deference she'd spent 3 years perfecting layered into it like careful lacquer. "His labs came back 90 minutes ago. Elevated BUN and creatinine. Possible acute kidney injury on the tail end of severe dehydration. The intake note doesn't mention fluid status assessment, so I was going to call the resident." Ashford turned to her with the expression of a man encountering an unexpected insect. "I'm sorry, what's your name again?" "Ashley." "Right. Ashley, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the attending is aware of Mr. Reeves's presentation. We don't need nursing staff conducting diagnostic interpretations. There's a chain of command for a reason." He turned back to his residents. "You'll notice this is a common dynamic in hospital culture, overstepping boundaries. Nursing means well, but they lack the training to understand clinical context. It's important to establish professional hierarchy early." The residents didn't laugh. They didn't have to. The message was already delivered, and Ashley received it like she'd received 100 messages like it in 3 years of nights and double shifts and being someone the institution had no intention of respecting. She finished her documentation. She didn't look up at Ashford. She didn't meet the eyes of the residents. She simply existed in the space his words had carved out for her, small and compliant and exactly what he needed to see. But Marcus Reeves was awake now, watching her. His hands had stopped shaking. Something in his expression had shifted, recognition, maybe, or the particular awareness that soldiers develop about people who've learned not to flinch. When Ashford moved on to the next bed, Ashley remained standing at Marcus's side, checking the fall line that was already perfectly fine, adjusting the blanket that was already perfectly adjusted, buying herself 20 more seconds in the presence of something she'd thought she'd buried 20 years ago. "You okay?" His voice was rough, unused, the kind of voice that didn't get much practice anymore. "Doing fine, Sergeant. How are you feeling?" "I've been better." He paused. His eyes were searching her face like he was trying to solve a problem. "Have we met before?" Ashley's hands completed their work. She stepped back from the bed, her composure settling around her like armor. First time we've met, Sergeant. But I'll be here all night if you need anything. Just use the call button. She moved away before he could ask another question, back into the rhythm of the unit, back into the role of the quiet nurse who kept her head down and didn't challenge doctors and pretended that the recognition, his recognition, her terrible, perfect recognition, hadn't just rewritten whatever remained of the person she used to be. The night was going to be a very long night. The night shift began like all the others now, quiet hallways, the smell of industrial antiseptic cutting through the hum of ventilators on the cardiac wing. Ashley checked her reassignment memo one more time, even though she'd memorized it. Night shift. Permanent. Performance improvement required. The words blurred together after the 15th read. But Marcus wasn't on the cardiac wing anymore. She made her way down 2 flights of stairs, her boots echoing against linoleum in the stairwell. The fluorescent strips above cast everything in a sickly white glow. She wasn't supposed to be checking on him. Ashford had made that crystal clear in the written warning now plastered on the unit board where every staff member would see it. A. Cooper. Insubordination. Overstepping clinical boundaries. The words might as well have been branded on her forehead. Still, she needed to see him. Just once more tonight. The eastern corridor was darker than it should have been. Security cuts, probably. Budget constraints. Jacksonville General had been trimming costs for 3 fiscal quarters running, which meant skeleton night crews, compromised access protocols, and patients like Marcus Reeves sleeping 2 floors below where anyone competent could actually monitor him. Dr. Ashford was in the chart room when Ashley had clocked in. She'd watched him through the glass partition as he'd flipped through patient files with the disinterested speed of a man checking off boxes. 20 seconds per chart. 30 if the patient was particularly complex. When he reached Marcus's file, he spent exactly 19 seconds reviewing the sergeant's psychiatric evaluations, his trauma indicators, the sleep disturbance log she'd meticulously documented over the past 72 hours. 19 seconds for a man who'd survived 3 IED explosions. Discharge papers, Ashford had announced to the resident standing beside him, his voice carrying the kind of casual certainty that made other people nod and comply. 48 hours. Get the transfer orders processed to Riverside Psychiatric, they're expecting him. The resident, a woman named Chen who was perhaps 6 months into her residency, had hesitated. Just for a moment. Sir, his PTSD metrics are still elevated. The sleep study showed. Chen. Ashford's tone could have cut glass. When you're ready to practice medicine instead of nursing, let me know. For now, pull the discharge papers. That was when Ashley had found herself moving, her feet carrying her down the hallway before her brain had fully authorized the decision. Insubordination. Overstepping boundaries. The warning on the unit board had been dry cleaning her reputation for 6 hours, and she was about to make it worse. She caught up with Ashford in the East Corridor, just outside the medication dispensary. His tie was silk, probably cost $400. His watch was polished stainless steel. Everything about Dr. Marcus Ashford said authority, the kind that came from old money, better schools, connections that started in childhood and compounded like interest. Doctor, may I speak with you? He turned, eyebrows rising as though she were a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned. 15 years of medical training, his gaze said. 3 years of bedpan duty wasn't qualified to address him in a hallway. Nurse Cooper. Isn't it past your shift change? Sergeant Reeves is showing signs of acute combat-related distress. Her voice stayed level, each word measured and separate, the way she'd learned to speak in briefings where lives depended on clarity. His sleep cycle has been fragmented. His cortisol markers are elevated. I believe premature discharge could constitute your opinion. Ashford smiled, and the smile was worse than anger would have been. When you complete medical school, you can make clinical decisions. Until then, chart his vitals and remember your lane. He walked past her without waiting for a response. The smell of his cologne, something expensive and cloying, lingered in the corridor like a territorial marker. The rest of that afternoon moved like a film playing at half speed. Ashley documented vitals, checked full lines, changed dressings. She existed in the hospital the way a ghost exists in a room, present but unregistered, acknowledged only by the patient she was attending. Other nurses had started the whispering earlier that day. She caught fragments, ambitious, doesn't know when to stay quiet, Ashford's going to destroy her. At 4 o'clock, Marcus's mother and sister arrived. His mother was a small woman with grey threading through her dark hair, and his sister had his eyes, sharp, aware, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned young that the world could break open without warning. Ashley brought them tea. English breakfast, the only kind the hospital stocked that wasn't completely terrible. "Your son's doing well physically," she said, setting the cup on the bedside table. "But I want to make sure you know, if you have concerns about his care, about the pace of his discharge, you can advocate for additional observation. You have that right." Marcus's mother glanced at her with sudden intensity. "He had nightmares again last night. Bad ones. He wouldn't talk about it, but I heard him from the waiting room." "That's important information," Ashley said quietly. "PTSD symptoms can escalate under stress. Premature discharge." The hallway door swung open. Ashford stood in the threshold, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop. Behind him, Chen hovered with a clipboard, looking like she wanted to evaporate. "Nurse Cooper." His voice was the one that made residents flinch. "A word." She followed him to the nurses' station, where the unit board was visible to everyone passing through, residents, attending physicians, orderlies, family members. Ashford positioned himself directly in front of it, making sure the audience was gathered, making sure the performance had witnesses. "It has come to my attention that you are providing unsolicited clinical guidance to patients' families." His tone was conversational, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been shouting. "It seems Nurse Cooper believes her 3 years of bedpan duty qualifies her to override my 15 years of medical training." He paused. "Let that sink in." The hallway had gone quiet in the way only hospitals go quiet, a silence that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. "Tell me, Nightingale," he used the nickname with a kind of contempt usually reserved for insects. "Did you perhaps attend Johns Hopkins in your spare time? Medical school at night, medical practice by day? Is that the curriculum they're running these days?" The family had shifted uncomfortably. Chen was staring at her shoes. A third-year resident named Morrison was suddenly very focused on his phone. Ashley took one breath. Just one. She felt something hot building behind her eyes, something that wanted to crack and spill, and she pushed it down the way she'd learned to push down fear, by acknowledging it existed and choosing not to let it speak. "I simply believe the patient deserves our full attention, doctor." Her voice was quiet, steady as surgical steel. No tremor, no break, no apology hiding in the spaces between words. She walked away while Ashford called after her about insubordination and scope of practice and reporting to the state nursing board. She didn't turn around. She didn't hurry. She simply moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. That evening in the break room, she sat with cold pasta she wasn't hungry for. Around her, the hospital hummed, distant pages, the soft beep of monitors, the pneumatic hiss of doors opening and closing. 3 nurses gathered their trays mid-conversation, their forks scraping linoleum with deliberate noise, and left without a word. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't even pretend it was coincidence. By the next morning, the unit board displayed a formal citation in black ink, A. Cooper, written warning, insubordination and overstepping clinical boundaries. She read it while a resident pretended not to see her from the corner of the hallway. She didn't stop. Didn't pause. Just moved past as though the warning was something printed on a wall instead of something printed on her chest. When she returned to the break room at dinner, the same thing happened. The same 3 nurses, gathering their things, leaving in tactical silence, until she sat alone at the table meant for 12. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an almost mocking rhythm. The pasta was colder than before. But that wasn't the worst part. In his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Ashford was holding his phone to his ear, speaking to someone named Harrison on the credentialing committee. His tie was loosened now, his expression focused with the intensity of a man executing a plan he'd refined across years of hospital politics. Around him, 3 shift schedules were printed out and marked with red pen, crossing through her name, reassigning her shifts, restricting her patient access through a series of performance reviews that he was already composing in his mind. "I'm implementing immediate restrictions," Ashford was saying. "Night shift only. Medication administration requires supervisory approval. And I'm escalating this to the board." The voice on the other end of the line said something that made him smile. "Thank you, Harrison. I appreciate your support. This woman doesn't understand her limitations, and someone needs to teach her." He hung up and looked out his window toward the east corridor, where Ashley was charting Marcus's vitals in real time, documenting every detail, fighting to keep her patient alive with the only weapon she had left: precision, dedication, and a steadfastness that no written warning could touch. The next night, Marcus was scheduled for discharge in 16 hours. The transfer paperwork had already been expedited. The external facility, Riverside Psychiatric, had already approved his admission, though their intake criteria were notably less rigorous than Seattle General's. Something was moving in the shadows of the hospital's infrastructure. Something that wanted what was in Marcus's medical records badly enough to kill for it. But Ashley didn't know that yet. Not yet. She was alone on the eastern corridor, charting, when the doors to the stairwell opened. Ashford was waiting outside her locker when she arrived for the night shift, a manila folder tucked under his arm like a weapon. The hallway corridor was empty except for the two of them, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look like it belonged to a corpse. She knew what was coming before he opened his mouth. She'd seen this pattern before, in Helmand Province, when command wanted you gone but needed the paperwork to justify it. "Major Cooper," he said, the title dripping with mockage. "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to permanent night shift, trauma wing, basement level. Your access to the cardiac unit is restricted." He didn't hand her the folder. He let it dangle between them like bait. "It's all here. Performance review, access restrictions, clinical authority limitations. All signed by the credentialing committee." She took the folder. Her hands were steady. She always kept her hand steady in front of him. Inside were 3 pages of dense hospital bureaucracy, each one stamped with official seals like they were orders from a wartime general instead of a doctor with a god complex and a board connection. The language was careful, precise, calculated to sound clinical while being utterly personal. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. Excessive emotional investment in patient outcomes. Inappropriate questioning of physician judgment. Every line was a surgical cut, designed to bleed out slowly, to make it look like an accident. "The committee felt this was appropriate given your recent performance concerns," Ashford continued, his voice taking on that particular cadence of false regret. "Nothing personal. We just need nurses who understand the hierarchy here. Who understand their place." She read the words without really reading them. The real message was in what wasn't written: she was being removed from Marcus's care. She was being buried in the basement, on night shift, where her voice would matter even less. And the paper trail was being built so carefully, so systematically, that if she tried to fight back, she'd be fighting against her own signature, her own record, her own official failures. The basement trauma wing. Night shift only. Access restricted to non-critical patients. The restrictions weren't accidental. They were a cage constructed of policy and procedure, and every bar was legally ironclad. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly, and watched the flicker of surprise cross his face. He'd expected resistance. He'd wanted resistance. Defiance he could leverage, could turn into another notation in her file. Instead, he got compliance. The kind of compliance that felt like a weapon. She turned and walked to his office before he could dismiss her, pushed through the door without knocking, and closed it behind her. The office smelled like expensive cologne and old leather, the smell of a man who believed his own mythology. Ashford came in behind her, already angry that she'd violated his hierarchy by being the one to dictate the next moment. "What are you?" he started. "You can take my schedule," she said, her voice steady as a tactical radio frequency, "but you can't take what I know is right." She looked him in the eye. One tear escaped, pure and deliberate, sliding down her cheek in a way that would have looked like breaking if you didn't know what you were actually watching. It wasn't fear. It wasn't despair. It was the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst the world could do, and choosing mercy for someone who didn't deserve it. She wiped it away without blinking, her gaze never leaving his, and then she turned and walked toward the door. "I will report you to the State Nursing Board," Ashford sputtered, his voice cracking like porcelain dropped on tile. "I will have your license suspended. You will never work in any hospital in this state again. I have the connections, the influence. Do you understand what you're risking?" She paused at the door frame. Didn't turn around. "I understand exactly what I'm risking," she said, and the words came out in a voice that wasn't quite hers anymore, the voice of someone who had made peace with the consequences of doing what was right. "And I'm risking it anyway." Then she stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind her, the sound of it shutting as final as a salute. Behind her, she could hear him breathing hard, could hear the folder being slammed onto his desk, could hear the small animal rage of a man who had tried to break someone and discovered she was already broken by things far worse than his petty tyranny. 2 nights later, at 2:51 a.m., the night shift was running skeleton crew. Ashley was in the basement trauma wing, processing discharge paperwork, when she heard the code alert blare across the intercom, "Code Gray, 3rd floor cardiac unit." "Code Gray, 3rd floor cardiac unit." Security responded in real time, voices crackling through radios, but something in her chest pulled tight. Code Gray was hospital speak for violent threat. Code Gray on Marcus's floor. She didn't think. She moved. The service stairs were faster than the main elevator, and her legs remembered the pace, up 3 flights like she was running combat patrol in the Sanjin Valley, bootsteps echoing against concrete. Her badge was already out, her ID card ready. The 3rd floor hallway was controlled chaos, a nurse she didn't recognize at the station, 2 security officers moving toward a room at the far end, their hands on their restraint kits but moving slow, like they were still trying to figure out what was happening. Ashley moved fast. Marcus's door was open, and inside was a man in street clothes, dark jacket, jeans, the kind of face that only existed in interrogation reports, standing over the sergeant's bed, his voice a low rapid growl that she recognized as the speech pattern of someone operating on adrenaline and desperation. "The records. I need his medical records from the transfer paperwork." Where did Ashford send them? Marcus was pressed back against his pillow, eyes wide with the specific look of someone reliving mortar fire, and his hands were shaking in a way that told Ashley everything about his nervous system right now. Trauma response, fear response, the biochemistry of being cornered by something his reptile brain couldn't categorize as safe. She stepped into the doorway with a kind of precision that comes from knowing exactly how much space your body takes up in a room, how to make yourself a barrier without being aggressive about it. "Sir, you need to leave this room immediately," she said, and her voice was different now, the voice of someone who had given orders in triage situations where disobedience meant death. Clear. Flat. Not a request. The man turned, and she saw his face adjust from surprise to calculation to something harder. His right hand was still in his jacket pocket. She'd already catalogued that detail at the moment she walked in, the way his elbow was bent, the way the fabric pulled slightly, the way his shoulders tensed around whatever he was holding. "The records," he said again. "I'm here for the sergeant's records." "I'm not asking again, nurse," he continued, but his voice had changed. It had dropped a register, picked up an edge that matched the way his hand was moving, the way he was drawing his arm out of his jacket pocket with the kind of focused intention that meant he'd made a decision about how this was going to end. The knife came out like something alive, a 6-inch folding blade that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in a way that made Ashley's whole tactical assessment shift. It wasn't a threat. It was a commitment. It was him saying, "I will use this, and I will use it now." She didn't move. Her body became a physical barrier between the knife and Marcus's bed, her hands positioned low and ready, every muscle coiled into the specific kind of stillness that comes right before violence. Pain was data. Threat assessment was automatic. Helmand Province had taught her how to read the microseconds before someone decided to kill you, and every instinct in her nervous system was screaming that this man had already crossed the threshold. "Neither am I," she said, and she meant it in a way that made him pause, that made his pupils dilate because he recognized the voice of someone who wasn't bluffing. His hand came up. She reached for the panic alarm button on the wall at the same moment his arm came forward. Time didn't slow down, it just became crystalline, every detail sharp and separate. The knife was a line of silver. Her shoulder was where it landed first, the blade sliding through scrubs and skin with a sensation like fire and ice happening at the same moment. Her hand pressed the alarm button and the panic screamed through the hospital's intercom system, a wailing electronic shriek that made everything else irrelevant. The man wasn't done. He twisted and came at her again, his face twisted with the kind of focus that meant he was already committed, already past the point of thinking about consequences. The second strike came lower, caught her in the side, the blade twisting as it went in, and she felt something rupture, something give way in the architecture of her ribs. Pain was information. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from the 1st Battalion Aid Station in Helmand Province, from nights holding field dressings over wounds that shouldn't have survived, from the kind of medical training you only got when your instructors had to assume you might be the only medic on the ground in a combat situation. Direct pressure. Assess the wound. Apply a tourniquet if available. Control the bleeding. Call for help. Stay conscious. She was pressing her hand against her side, her other hand still on the alarm, blood soaking through her scrubs in a pattern that would have alarmed a civilian nurse but looked familiar to her, controllable, manageable, survivable if she kept her vitals steady and her breathing regular. Marcus was screaming her name. That detail cut through everything else. He was screaming for her, and she was bleeding onto his floor, and the knife man was moving toward the door because security was coming, their footsteps pounding down the hallway like they meant business. She kept her hand pressed to her side. She kept breathing. The man in the jacket bolted, and security burst through the door in a coordinated sweep that told her they'd been trained for exactly this scenario. 2 officers with hands already reaching for restraints, a third with a radio calling codes and requesting a security lockdown on all exits. Trauma Bay, Ashley heard herself say. Notify trauma. I need to stay here but I need someone to come to me. Stab wounds, shoulder and flank, possible lung puncture, blood loss is, she checked her hand, assessed the saturation rate, calculated based on what she could see through the spreading red, controlled but we need baseline vitals. One of the security officers looked at her like she'd just started speaking a language he didn't know. She was the victim, and she was giving orders like she was running the scene. She looked at Marcus instead. Made sure her eyes were steady, her expression wasn't fear or pain or any of the things he needed to see right now. It's okay, Sergeant, she said, her voice the same level it had been when she'd told the knife man no. You're safe. I've got you. His face crumpled, but he was breathing, and he wasn't in the immediate shock response anymore, and that was what mattered. She'd stepped between him and violence, and she'd done it again, and even though she was bleeding onto the tile floor of a hospital where a man with a pen was trying to destroy her, she'd kept him safe. She could feel the blood loss now, the way her vision was starting to soften at the edges, the way her hands were moving into that familiar pattern of shock response. Not panic, control. The kind of composure that came from knowing you'd survived worse and might survive this too. The pain in her side became white noise. She stayed conscious long enough to apply pressure using the combat medicine techniques she swore she'd never need again, her hand steady against her ribs, her breathing deliberate and measured. Security was setting up around her, someone was running with a stretcher, someone else was calling for the trauma surgeon, and the last thing she remembered was Marcus's voice calling out her name as everything went dark like the lights were switching off in a mortar strike, and then there was nothing at all but the feeling of cold tile against her cheek and the certainty that she'd done the right thing, even if the right thing was going to cost her everything. Recovery came in layers. First, the ceiling tiles. Then the beeping, not one monitor but 2, their rhythms offset like a duet nobody asked for. Ashley's right shoulder screamed. Her left side screamed louder. The morphine drip was doing its job, softening the edges of pain into something almost manageable, something almost dreamlike, but her hands knew better. Her hands remembered the pressure. The warmth. The way blood feels different when it's yours. She tried to move. Mistake. Her rib sent a message in all caps. Instead, she lay still, breathing through her nose, using the same box-breathing cadence she'd used in the field, for counts in, for counts hold, for counts out. The medical staff had sewn 23 stitches into her shoulder. 41 into her side. She'd counted them going in, some distant part of her brain cataloging damage the way it always did, translating trauma into data because data was safer than feeling. The door opened. Not a nurse checking vitals. Not Marcus. Dr. Ashford stepped through, and the temperature in the room dropped. He wasn't wearing his white coat. He changed into a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ashley's monthly rent. His tie was silk. His expression was something carved from stone, not angry, worse than angry. Disappointed. Like she'd failed a simple test and he was genuinely confused by her incompetence. In his right hand, a manila folder. He didn't speak. He simply pulled the visitor chair close to her bed, sat down with the careful precision of a man settling into a position of power, and opened the folder across her chest. The paper was crisp. The letterhead read Seattle General Human Resources in official sans serif. Miss Cooper, he began, his voice steady as a scalpel finding exactly the right depth, effective immediately, your employment at Seattle General is terminated. Ashley's eyes tracked the words on the page. Termination. For cause. Failure to follow de-escalation protocols. Endangering hospital security. The letters seemed to multiply, spreading like infection across white paper. The incident report is quite clear, Ashford continued, as if she'd argued. As if she'd said anything at all. You escalated a situation that could have been resolved through standard security protocol. Instead, you intervened physically, creating a confrontation that resulted in your own injury and potential risk to the patient. Potential risk. Marcus had been defenseless on that bed. Some man in street clothes with a knife and a vendetta was demanding records that shouldn't have been transferred in the first place. Ashley had 30 seconds to choose between protocol and her patient, and she'd chosen the only way that made sense. I don't understand, she said, her voice still hoarse from the intubation they'd kept her under just in case. Marcus was in danger. The attacker? Alleged attacker, Ashford interrupted, his tone suggesting she was being deliberately obtuse. According to the amended incident report, you initiated physical contact, which escalated the situation unnecessarily. Our security team has extensive training in de-escalation. You bypassed that training, inserted yourself into a situation outside your clinical scope, and created a medical emergency that could have been catastrophic. The amended incident report. There it was. Past tense. Already changed. Ashley's eyes moved to his face. Looking for something human there, something that might recognize what had actually happened in that room. What she found instead was a man who had already erased her version of events before she even woke up. The witnessing nurses, she started, have been reassigned to different units, Ashford said smoothly. As part of routine staffing optimization. Any testimony they might provide would be contradictory and potentially damaging to their own credibility. I've already documented concerns about their judgment in their personnel files. The legal department believes this termination is defensible. In fact, it's prudent. There it was. The machine working exactly as designed. He'd moved faster than she could move, changed facts before she could defend them, isolated witnesses before she could find allies. This wasn't just firing her. This was erasure. What about Marcus? Ashley's hands had curled into fists without her permission. Pain flared through her ribs, a sharp reminder that her body wasn't under her control right now. He'll need continuous monitoring. His kidney function. The patient has been discharged to Riverside Medical Facility, where he will receive appropriate care consistent with his current condition. Ashford stood, closing the folder with the decisive snap of a door slamming. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address. You'll receive information from our legal department regarding the non-disclosure agreement you'll be signing. Breaching that agreement will result in additional litigation that you cannot afford. He moved toward the door, paused, and turned back. One final statement delivered from the threshold, as if an afterthought, which meant it was the carefully calculated peak of his assault. I've spoken with the state nursing board as well, he said. Not an official complaint yet, but a heads up regarding your psychological fitness for clinical practice. They're aware of your pattern of insubordination, your difficulty following hierarchy, your hero complex. When your license comes up for review, they'll have context for any future incidents. I'm actually protecting you by recommending a voluntary leave of absence. Helps your narrative. He left before she could respond. Ashley lay in the hospital bed, bandaged and broken and morphine-drunk, watching the door close on a man who'd just systematized her destruction with the same precision she'd used to close wounds. The next 72 hours moved in slow motion. A physical therapist came, showed her how to move without tearing stitches. A social worker offered resources. A hospital chaplain asked if she wanted to talk about her feelings, which made Ashley laugh and then immediately regret it because laughing felt like being stabbed again. On the fourth day, Marcus tried to visit. The nurse on duty turned him away at the desk, reading from a chart that said, "Patient requests no visitors." Ashley hadn't requested that. She'd requested nothing. Ashford had simply written it. By day 6, she was discharged to her apartment, which smelled like stale coffee and the radiator's death rattle. The faded 101st Airborne patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs now by the bandages. An accusation. A ghost. A thing that had meant something once, in a place that had required her to be strong, and now meant nothing at all in a place that had found her too strong to keep. She didn't look at her phone for 2 days. When she finally did, there were no messages. No calls. The break room colleague she'd thought might reach out, no one. Marcus's number, in her recent contacts, unused. Dr. Ashford's name had already been removed from her phone, but his presence remained, a space shaped like his absence. On day 8 post-stabbing, Ashley sat in her car in the parking garage of her apartment building. The engine was off. She'd meant to drive somewhere, home was already where she was, but the thought of turning the key had seemed insurmountable. The sun was setting outside the windshield, painting the concrete in shades of orange that made everything look like it was burning. She'd survived firefights in Helm and Province. She'd performed emergency surgery under mortar fire using a combat knife and her own hands. She'd carried an 8-year-old boy through smoke and blood and the specific kind of terror that comes when you know you might not make it but you're going to try anyway. And now she was destroyed by a man with a fountain pen. The tears came without permission, the way the best things always did in the field, unexpected, overwhelming, impossible to stop once they started. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. Her shoulders shook. She'd spent 2 decades learning not to break, learning how to compartmentalize and survive and keep moving, and none of that training had prepared her for the particular kind of breaking that happened when the enemy wore a suit and had institutional backing. The faded patch pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She closed her eyes and stopped fighting, the way she hadn't stopped fighting in a decade. The windshield fogged with her breath. The car was cold. Outside, the garage lights buzzed and flickered. She sat there as the sun finished setting, as the shadows of the parking garage turned into the shadows of something much larger and darker, and she didn't know if she'd ever be able to turn that key again. That was when her phone rang. The morning light filtered through the hospital administrator's office windows as Dr. Ashford arranged his files across the mahogany conference table. 6 months of work. 6 months of strategic documentation, witness reassignments, altered incident reports filed with surgical precision. He'd built a narrative so airtight that even the state nursing board had begun their preliminary investigation into Ashley Cooper's fitness to practice. Today he would present his findings to the hospital credentialing committee. Today they would vote to officially revoke her license and cement his authority over the trauma unit. He straightened his tie, Italian silk, $340, and smiled at his reflection in the window. The administrator's assistant entered, pale. "Dr. Ashford, there's a situation in the lobby." "Can it wait?" "The board convenes in 20 minutes. "I don't think so, sir. There's a military convoy outside. They've requested," she swallowed. "They've requested Major Cooper by name and rank." The words landed like a thrown blade. Ashford's hands went still on his papers. "Major? She's a nurse. A civilian employee." "They know who she is, sir." The lobby had transformed into something that looked like a state visit. 100 Army officers stood in perfect formation, their dress uniforms the color of storm clouds, boots polished to mirror shine. They came from 17 different units: the 75th Ranger Regiment, the 160th SAW Night Stalkers, the 1st SFOD Delta, Fort Campbell, Fort Lewis, bases from across the continental United States. Their presence occupied space like a physical force, the air pressure changing the way it does when a thunderstorm rolls in. Security personnel stood motionless, uncertain whether to call for backup or stand at attention themselves. Sergeant Marcus Reeves stood at the formation's front. He wore his Class A uniform with the patch of the 101st Airborne on his sleeve, the unit that had saved his life in Helmand Province, and the nurse who'd just saved it again in Jacksonville. His jaw was set with the kind of calm that comes from survival. His eyes tracked the stairwell door. The lobby's fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm as 100 military professionals waited in absolute silence. The stairwell door opened. Ashley emerged mid-stride, still bandaged under her civilian clothes, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body remembered how to hurt and chose to move anyway. She wore no uniform. No insignia. Just scrubs with blood-stained ghosts she couldn't quite wash out. Marcus's voice cut through the silence like a command, "Major, they're here for you." Ashley stopped. One breath. The lobby seemed to hold its own breath with her. The temperature of the room shifted, those 100 soldiers straightened infinitesimally, their bearing changing in a way that signaled recognition of rank passing between them like electricity through copper wire. The administrator approached her with trembling hands. The file he held was thick, redacted sections visible, official seals intact, the weight of bureaucracy transformed into evidence of a completely different kind of authority. "Major Cooper, these documents arrived this morning from the Pentagon. Your service record. Complete declassification authorization from," his voice cracked. "From CENTCOM." Ashley opened the file without expression. The first page was stark and official: Cooper, Ashley J., a Major, United States Army. Medical Corps. Service Record Summary. The next pages listed her assignments. Fallujah. Sanjan Valley. Bagram Airfield. 3 Purple Hearts. A Bronze Star with Valor. Then a commendation so classified that only the header and the date were unredacted, except for one phrase in bold, for extraordinary heroism in saving 12 lives, including 1 civilian child evacuee, during the field hospital bombing in Helmand Province, October 14, 2004. The colonel at the formation's front stepped forward. His insignia read, Colonel Mitchell Hayes, 160th Special Operations. His voice carried the weight of formal ceremony and carried it all the way to the back of the lobby where Dr. Ashford had gone very still. "Major Cooper, on behalf of the United States Army and the soldiers under your former command, we are here to formally recognize your service. 3 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. A commendation that classified means you saved lives in a situation where most officers would have ordered retreat. The sergeant you protected in this hospital 4 days ago? He was 8 years old when you shielded him during a mortar attack in Helmand Province. He spent 15 years wondering if that nurse was real or if fear had invented her. When he learned her actual identity, when he learned the woman who stood between him and a knife was the same woman who stood between him and shrapnel 2 decades ago, he made one call. He called his unit. And here we are." The administrator's hands shook as he continued, and his voice carried the tremor of someone watching institutional authority reverse direction. "Major, I have another file. This one just arrived from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Our hospital's discharge practices triggered a federal audit. It's the investigation Dr. Ashford launched against you, the altered incident reports, the reassigned witnesses, the complaints filed with the state nursing board, created a paper trail. A very specific paper trail. That led directly to him." A woman in a dark suit stepped forward. FBI credentials visible. Dr. Ashford's attempt to access Major Cooper's medical records flagged an ongoing investigation into Seattle General's billing practices. "We found financial transfers totaling $847,000 over 7 years. One transfer for every patient discharged prematurely to external facilities. We found his authorization codes on altered discharge summaries. We found pressure communications to nursing staff threatening reassignments and performance reviews if they didn't comply. His own weapon has circled back, Doctor. 6 years of fraud, documented. The State Medical Board has been notified. Your privileges are suspended immediately pending criminal investigation." Dr. Ashford stood at the conference room threshold, the credentialing files scattered across the mahogany table behind him like evidence from a crime scene. His face had gone the color of old bone. Security officers approached him, not roughly, but with the inexorable precision of procedure. His mouth opened and closed without words. Ashley began walking. Not toward the exit. Toward him. She moved like she'd moved through every crisis of her adult life, one breath, one decision, one step forward through the noise. She stopped in front of him and spoke in a voice that barely carried, but every one of those 100 soldiers heard it. "You took my schedule, Doctor. But you couldn't take what I knew was right." The color left his face entirely. His hands came up in a gesture that might have been apology or appeal, but Ashley had already turned away. She walked toward the colonel and the 100 officers, and as she did, every single one of them came to attention. The movement was synchronized, military precise, the sound of 100 boots finding purchase on tile simultaneously. The stairwell doors opened again. The administrator escorted them upward. 6 months later, Ashley Cooper walked through Seattle General in a white coat. The embroidery read Chief of Trauma Services. Her office occupied the corner suite on the 4th floor, the one that used to belong to the department head, the one with windows facing the city and the morning light coming in the way light comes into places where decisions are made with clarity. The faded 101st Airborne patch, worn inside her jacket lining for 2 decades, now rested in a frame on her office wall beside the Bronze Star. Beside a photograph from the ceremony, 100 soldiers standing in dress uniform, and in the center, Major Ashley Cooper with her eyes forward. The unit board where her written warning used to hang, the one posted for all staff to see, the one that announced her insubordination to residents and nurses and anyone who might have doubted her judgment, now displayed her military commendation. The text was unclassified just enough to read, for heroic actions in direct defense of personnel under her command. She passed the night security station and didn't slow her pace. Dr. Ashford pushed a cleaning cart past the window, his uniform 2 sizes too large, his eyes fixed on the floor. He no longer held institutional power. He no longer held anything but a mop handle and the weight of what he'd become. A young nurse sat across from Ashley's desk, nervous. This nurse had been written up 2 weeks ago for questioning an attending's medication order. Same pattern. Same power play. Same institutional machinery grinding toward erasure. Ashley slid the 101st Airborne patch across the desk. Sometimes doing right means standing alone. But you're not alone. Not anymore. The nurse's eyes filled with tears that she'd been holding back for 14 days. From her window, Ashley watched Ashford empty trash in the parking garage, his movement small and repetitive. She felt nothing. No triumph. No bitterness. No need for revenge because the revenge had already arrived in the form of consequence. She turned back to her computer and approved a schedule change, a patient care decision that contradicted the preferences of an attending physician, placed human need over political favor, and bore her signature and her authority. She spoke to the empty room, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak it. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The words echoed against walls that had tried to break her. In the hospital that now bore her standard. Hey, if this story made you feel the weight of institutional injustice and the power of hidden courage, hit that subscribe button. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value? And share this with anyone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Thanks for watching.